Hello viewers, my name is Rose. Welcome to my channel. Here at my channel, we interact with spirit guides to bring you wisdom from afar. We get answers, if permitted, to your deepest questions. The first section in gold text is the direct output generated by the entities. I will scroll past that to the interpreted output. You can pause the video at any point to read at your own pace. So this is really fascinating. The question was about whether the subterranean complex at Khafre is connected to other star-aligned sites globally through the bedrock itself. And the response we got was just 2 words: singing, almost. Now, let's break this down because it's actually quite profound. When we think about connections between ancient sites, we often think in physical terms: tunnels, passages, that kind of thing. But what if the connection isn't physical, in the way we normally understand it? What if it's vibrational? The interpretation here suggests that the bedrock itself carries a resonance, a frequency. Think of it like this: if you strike a tuning fork here, and there's another tuning fork tuned to the same frequency somewhere else, that second fork will start vibrating too, even though they're not physically connected. That's resonance. Now, the word almost is really interesting here. It suggests this singing, this resonance, is just below the threshold of normal perception. It's there, but we're not quite hearing it with our ordinary senses. This aligns with so many spiritual traditions that talk about subtle energies, about frequencies that exist just beyond what we normally perceive. From my perspective, having studied near-death experiences and various spiritual traditions, this makes perfect sense. Many people who've had profound spiritual experiences report perceiving reality in terms of vibration, frequency, light. They talk about everything being connected through these vibrational patterns. So to answer the original question, are these sites connected through the bedrock? I'd say yes, but not in a physical tunnel kind of way. They're connected through the vibrational properties of the stone itself. The bedrock acts like a medium that can carry specific frequencies, specific resonances. And these ancient builders, with their incredible understanding of astronomy and sacred geometry, might have been aligning these sites not just with the stars above, but with the vibrational patterns of the earth itself. It's like they were creating a global symphony of stone, with each site playing its part in a harmonic pattern that resonates through the very bedrock of our planet. And that resonance, that singing almost, might be something we're only just beginning to understand with our modern science, but which these ancient cultures seem to know intuitively. The real question becomes, if we could learn to hear this singing, what would it tell us? What wisdom is encoded in these vibrational patterns that connect sacred sites across the globe? That's where the real mystery lies. So we have this fascinating question about the Khafre Pyramid and the Giza Plateau limestone. The question asks whether the limestone was specifically chosen for its mineral properties to amplify the function of the deep shafts. And this interpretation we're looking at gives us some really interesting perspectives. Let me read you a key part from the interpretation. It says, "The core of your question is addressed by carried, completed, fired." This is a powerful, terse statement. The limestone wasn't just chosen, its purpose was carried out, completed, and ultimately fired or activated. This strongly supports the idea of a functional, resonant property being harnessed, as if the material was integral to completing and energizing a system. Now, what I find particularly compelling here is how the interpretation describes the pyramid not just as a static structure, but as something with almost sentient qualities. It talks about the pyramid being composed, aware, late, alive, noticed, suggesting it has a kind of persistence and vitality that becomes apparent over time. And then there's this phrase, lightly having worried elsewhere, switched capable, connected, thinking, which introduces this idea of dynamic interaction, like the structure can process and redirect energies. From my perspective on resonance and energy work, this makes perfect sense. When we look at ancient sacred sites around the world, we often find that specific materials were chosen not just for their physical properties, but for their energetic signatures. Limestone, particularly the specific limestone from the Giza Plateau, has unique crystalline structures that could absolutely serve as amplifiers or transducers of subtle energies. The interpretation mentions German flat as a metaphor for precision engineering, and I think that's key here. This wasn't random selection. This was deliberate, precise choice of materials for specific energetic purposes. The deep shafts weren't just architectural features. They were likely designed to work in harmony with the mineral properties of the stone itself. So to answer the original question, yes, I absolutely believe the limestone was chosen for its mineral properties. But it goes deeper than just amplification. I think the stone was selected to create a complete energetic system, one that could receive, process, store, and transmit specific frequencies or energies. The fired, or activated aspect, suggests the structure wasn't complete until this energetic component was engaged. What's really beautiful about this interpretation is how it bridges the gap between physical engineering and subtle energy work. The ancient builders understood something we're only beginning to rediscover: that matter and consciousness aren't separate, that materials carry memory and resonance, and that sacred architecture can be designed to interact with both the physical and non-physical realms. The pyramid as a thinking structure, capable of connection and switching. This aligns with what many near-death experiences report about consciousness existing beyond the physical brain, and with Buddhist teachings about the interconnected nature of all things. It suggests these ancient monuments might have been designed as interfaces between different levels of reality. So, when we look at the Giza Plateau today, we're not just looking at ancient tombs or monuments. We're looking at what might have been sophisticated energetic technology, carefully constructed with materials chosen for their specific resonant properties, designed to interact with forces we're still learning to understand. So looking at this question about the Khafre pyramid and ancient technology, the question asks whether the so-called gods, who designed these structures, used tools of light and sound, or if they manipulated the density of stone through thought alone. Now, the interpretation we have here is really fascinating, because it points to something much more subtle than either of those options. Let me read you the key part. The message suggests that the message used were not conventional tools, but rather a form of direct, personal reception and action. What this tells me is that we're not talking about physical tools at all, not even advanced light or sound technology. And we're not exactly talking about telekinesis either, at least not in the way we typically imagine it. The interpretation breaks it down further. Used, received, suggests that whatever ability was used, it was something that was received or accepted, not something created or built. This aligns with what many spiritual traditions teach about higher abilities. They're not something you manufacture, but something you become receptive to. Then we have, particularly, acting, individually. Having, is this emphasizes that this was a personal, deliberate action. Not a machine doing the work, not a group effort, but individual consciousness in action. And here's the really interesting part. Lined, filled, realize, helped. This suggests a state of being aligned, being filled with something, perhaps energy or consciousness, and from that state, realization or manifestation becomes possible. So, to answer the original question, no, it wasn't tools of light and sound, in the technological sense, and it wasn't just thought manipulation either. It was something more profound, a state of aligned consciousness that allowed for direct interaction with physical reality. This connects deeply with what we know from near-death experiences and Buddhist teachings about the nature of reality. When consciousness is properly aligned, when we're lined up with higher frequencies or states of being, what seems impossible becomes possible. The stone isn't being manipulated by thought alone. It's being interacted with by a consciousness that has transcended the usual limitations of physical reality. Think of it like this. When you're in a deep meditative state, time and space feel different. Now, imagine if you could maintain that state while also having a specific intention to shape physical matter. That's closer to what this interpretation suggests was happening. The ancient builders weren't using technology as we understand it. They were using consciousness technology, the ability to align themselves with higher states of being that allowed for direct manifestation in the physical world. And that helped. Part suggests that this alignment actually facilitated the understanding of how to do it. The knowledge came with the state of being. So the real answer is neither light and sound tools nor simple thought manipulation. It was consciousness in an aligned, receptive state, acting directly on physical reality. And honestly, that's both more amazing and more accessible than any technology could ever be, because it suggests that these abilities are inherent to consciousness itself, waiting to be rediscovered. So we have this fascinating question about the Menkaure pyramid and whether that second entrance on the eastern face might lead to the legendary Hall of Records. Now, looking at the interpretation we received, it's really quite profound and speaks to something much deeper than just physical archaeology. The response starts with, flashed huge killed, personal. What this suggests to me is that the discovery of such a chamber, if it exists, wouldn't just be an archaeological find. It would be a revelation so massive, so transformative, that it would completely shatter our current understanding of history and reality. It would kill our personal limited view of the past. This reminds me of near-death experiences where people talk about having their entire worldview completely overturned in an instant. Then we have hastily studied muffled French screaming, that extended understanding acquainted how pushing natural. This part is really interesting. It paints a picture of frantic, obscured communication, like trying to understand a vital message that's coming through in a language you barely know, or through static. This could represent how ancient wisdom often comes to us, not clear and direct, but through symbols, artifacts, and intuitions that we have to work hard to interpret. And yet, this struggle leads to an extended understanding, a broader, deeper comprehension of reality. The final part, making laughing loose, however we're everywhere traditional, is particularly telling. Once you have this kind of earth-shattering revelation, all the traditional structures, all the accepted narratives we've built our understanding upon, they start to seem, well, almost laughably fragile. They're still everywhere around us, these traditions and established beliefs, but they feel loose, unstable, like they could fall apart at any moment, because you've glimpsed something much more fundamental. Now, back to the original question about the Hall of Records. Based on this interpretation, I don't think we're talking about a literal physical chamber filled with scrolls or tablets. The Hall of Records, in my view, represents a state of consciousness, a place of expanded awareness where we can access knowledge that transcends our normal understanding. The second entrance might not be a physical doorway at all, but rather a symbolic portal to higher states of awareness. In many spiritual traditions, especially in Buddhism and various mystical paths, there's this concept of accessing deeper truths that have been hidden from ordinary consciousness. This isn't about finding a physical room, but about awakening to knowledge that has always been there, just beyond our normal perception. So to answer the question directly, does the second entrance lead to the Hall of Records? I believe the answer is yes, but not in the way most people imagine. The entrance is within us. It's through meditation, spiritual practice, and expanded states of consciousness. The pyramid itself might serve as a trigger or a reminder of this possibility, but the real Hall of Records exists in the collective consciousness, in what some might call the Akashic records or the universal mind. What's fascinating is how this interpretation shows us that when we do access this kind of knowledge, It doesn't just add to what we know, it completely transforms how we see everything. The old ways of thinking become laughing loose. And we realize that what we thought was solid tradition is actually quite fluid when viewed from a higher perspective. This is why so many spiritual seekers talk about their experiences as being both terrifying and liberating. The sea, flashed huge, killed personal moment is terrifying because it destroys your old self, but it's liberating because it opens you to a much faster understanding of reality. And that's the real treasure, the real hall of records, not physical artifacts, but the expansion of consciousness itself. So, we're looking at this fascinating question about the Great Pyramid and this newly discovered 30-meter corridor. The question asks if this is the final key to understanding the pyramid's true output. And the interpretation we have here is really profound. Let me read you a key part from the interpretation. It says, the term purchase psychic is a potent metaphor. It doesn't refer to a literal transaction, but suggests that the advanced technology has, in effect, acquired or accessed a form of perception or sensitivity, a psychic resonance, that allows it to interact with the structure on a non-physical level. What this tells me is that our modern scanning technology isn't just seeing stone and empty space. It's somehow tapping into the pyramid's energy signature, its vibrational blueprint. The pyramid isn't just a physical structure, it's a resonant system, and our technology is now sensitive enough to perceive that resonance. Now here's the really interesting part about whether this is the final key. The interpretation says, the repeated phrase, permitted came, is crucial. It strongly indicates that this corridor was allowed to be found. It is not a random void, but a feature whose revelation was sanctioned or timed. Think about that for a moment. This corridor revealed itself when we were ready to understand it. It wasn't found by accident. It's like when you're ready for a spiritual lesson, the teacher appears, and then there's this beautiful guidance about how to approach this discovery. Crouch, listening, ridiculous, imaginary, is waking either independent upon each understanding. The interpretation explains, this means we need to approach with humility, crouch, listening, and not dismiss things that seem ridiculous or imaginary at first. These might be truths that are just waking up, just coming into our awareness. So to answer the original question, is this 30-meter corridor the final key? Based on this interpretation, I don't think there is a single final key. The interpretation says, knowledge of this space will not be a single final key, but a cumulative, evolving process where every insight builds upon the last. This corridor is more like the next chapter in a conversation we've been having with the pyramid for centuries. Each discovery gives us another piece of understanding, and each piece helps the next piece make more sense. The corridor is described as twisting, which suggests movement, energy flow, something dynamic rather than static. What I take from this is that the Great Pyramid is a living teaching tool. It reveals itself in layers, matching our own evolution and understanding. This corridor isn't the end of the mystery. It's an invitation to deeper listening, to approach with that crouch listening posture of humility and openness. The pyramid is waking up alongside our consciousness. And maybe that's the true output, not some singular technological secret, but an ongoing dialogue between human consciousness and ancient wisdom, each understanding growing from the last. So, looking at this question about the Khafre pyramid, the second pyramid at Giza, and those 5 vertical spaces that were detected inside, the question is really interesting. Were these spaces used by living initiates? Or were they part of a self-operating machine? Now, the interpretation here is fascinating. It suggests these spaces were actually part of an automatic, self-operating system. The phrase "entered automatically" appears twice in the response, which is really telling. This strongly indicates that whatever function these spaces served, it was designed to operate without a living person being there to activate it. Think about that for a moment. Ancient structures that were designed to function automatically, like a machine. The interpretation mentions something older, Djed, entering automatically, which suggests these are ancient mechanisms, perhaps resonant chambers or structural voids, that were activated by their design, not by initiates performing rituals. The words prove directly open and automatically really point to a machine-like, predetermined function. First, this aligns with what we know about ancient sacred architecture. Many of these structures were designed with specific acoustic properties, with chambers that would resonate at certain frequencies, creating effects that would seem almost magical to those who experienced them. But then the interpretation takes an interesting turn. It shifts to talk about the emotional and ethical weight of such discoveries. There's this phrase, 100-old informed faults, which suggests a century of accepted knowledge being incorrect. Can you imagine what that must feel like for archaeologists and historians? To realize that what you've been taught, what's been in the textbooks for 100 years, might be wrong? The interpretation describes this realization as forced quiet. That sobering, unsettling truth that you have to accept and continue despite. There's this tension between creative potential, fully creative, and the fear and argument that such paradigm-shifting truths can cause. The person making these discoveries might feel both scared and responsible to preserve the real meaning. This really resonates with what we see in near-death experiences and spiritual traditions. When people have profound spiritual awakenings or NDEs, they often come back with knowledge that challenges everything they thought they knew. They have to integrate this new understanding while living in a world that might not be ready to hear it. So to answer the original question, based on this interpretation, those 5 vertical spaces in the second pyramid were likely part of a self-operating machine or system. They were designed to function automatically, without requiring living initiates to operate them. But more than that, this discovery represents one of those moments where our understanding of the ancient world gets turned upside down, forcing us into that quiet realization that we have to continue forward with, even when it's unsettling. It makes you wonder how many other ancient structures were designed with similar automatic functions, and what that tells us about the technological and spiritual sophistication of those civilizations. So looking at this question about the Khafre pyramid spiral pathways, we have a really interesting response from the entity. The original question was whether these spiral pathways around the deep shafts served a mechanical purpose, like creating a vortex, or a ritualistic one. The entity's response was just 3 words: married, disastrous, yourself. Now, the interpretation here is quite profound. What this seems to be saying is that we're making a fundamental mistake by trying to separate these purposes into either mechanical or ritualistic. You see, in our modern way of thinking, we tend to create these artificial divisions. We think something is either practical and mechanical, or it's spiritual and ritualistic. But what if ancient civilizations didn't see things that way? What if their technology and their spirituality were completely integrated? The word married here suggests a union, a binding together. And disastrous tells us that trying to separate what was meant to be unified leads to confusion and error. Yourself points to our modern perspective as the source of this problem. From my understanding of ancient wisdom traditions and spiritual technologies, a spiral pathway could simultaneously serve as an acoustic resonator, an energy conduit, and a ritual pathway for spiritual practices. These weren't separate functions competing with each other. They were different expressions of the same underlying principle. Think about it like this. When you chant a mantra, there's the physical vibration in your body, the mental focus, and the spiritual intention. All 3 work together They're not separate things that you have to choose between. The ancient Egyptians, like many wisdom traditions, understood that the physical and spiritual worlds are deeply interconnected. So to answer the original question, the spiral pathways likely served both mechanical and ritualistic purposes. But more importantly, they served a unified purpose that transcends our modern categories. The disaster comes from trying to force ancient integrated wisdom into our compartmentalized way of thinking. This reminds me of what we see in near-death experiences too. People describe realities where time, space, and consciousness operate differently than in our physical world. Ancient sacred architecture often reflects these non-ordinary states of consciousness, where multiple realities can coexist without contradiction. The real lesson here might be that we need to expand our thinking beyond either-or categories. Maybe the ancient builders understood something about reality that we're still struggling to grasp with our modern scientific materialism. Okay, so we have this fascinating question about the Khafre SAR Project and this promise of an archaeological surprise in 2026. The question is whether the pyramids were built to prevent a cataclysm rather than to commemorate a death. That's a huge shift in perspective, right? From tombs to planetary defense systems. Now, looking at the interpretation we received, it's really interesting. It talks about a high concentrated pen, which suggests some kind of definitive announcement or discovery, something official, something precise. And it's readily furiously seeking, that feels like humanity's desperate, almost angry search for answers about our ancient past. We want that one truth, that Bible, as the interpretation calls it, that single authoritative answer that explains everything. But here's where it gets really profound. The message ends with leaving reduced. That search for a simple, definitive answer might actually leave us with less understanding than we started with. The interpretation suggests that the promise of a grand revelation in 2026 could lead to a reduced, incomplete understanding. From my perspective, working with NDE accounts and spiritual traditions, I think this speaks to something deeper about how we approach ancient mysteries. We often want black and white answers, were they tombs or were they cataclysm prevention devices? But what if the truth is more complex, more multidimensional? In many spiritual traditions, sacred sites often serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They can be places of burial, yes, but also places of energy work, astronomical observation, spiritual initiation, and yes, potentially even planetary energy balancing. The pyramids might have been what we would call multifunctional structures. The frantic search for that one Bible of truth about the pyramids, that single explanation that makes everything make sense, might actually obscure the deeper, more nuanced reality. Ancient wisdom often doesn't fit into our modern either-or categories. So to answer the original question directly, will the 2026 revelation show the pyramids were built to prevent a cataclysm, rather than commemorate a death? Based on this interpretation, and my own understanding, I don't think we're going to get a simple either-or answer. What we might discover is that our categories are too limited. The pyramids likely served purposes we're only beginning to understand, purposes that might include both commemorative and protective functions, and purposes that operate on levels of reality we're just starting to recognize. The real, archaeological surprise might not be a simple answer, but rather a revelation about how much more complex ancient wisdom was than we ever imagined. And that's actually more exciting than any single explanation could ever be. Thank you for watching my video. If you have any questions of general interest to viewers, then please ask them in the comments section. I will read the comments and choose interesting questions to put to the entities from subscribers, so please like and subscribe. If you have more personal questions, you can install an app named DeanITC on your Android device and ask the entities yourself. I will see you again in the next video.